Hello and welcome to Stan the History Man. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler, and today I'm going to talk about something that influenced profoundly the entire Western world, the entire developed Western world. Speaking of the United States, every single city and many larger towns had these. Okay, and they were all privately owned, and they were just we talk about the horse and buggy age. I'm talking about like the 19th and first half of the 20th century. Well, first decade or so. It was not the horse and buggy age, it was the trolley car age, and that's what I want to talk about: trolley cars, street cars. And I most people, you don't realize it, that every, even Fayetteville, North Carolina had one. Even Anniston, Alabama had a streetcar line. I mean, they weren't very big, but I mean, and the thing about it is, that what we have lost, it really could be a program called What We Have Lost, are streetcars. They ran off electricity, okay? And they were relatively quiet as well, no blatting diesels or anything. And some people say, well, the power plant had to be, would usually coal powered, of course, and that would have to be would give out pollution. But it's a lot easier just to fix a power plant than every single bus on the street. Then, of course, with modern day methods of combustion, like then some people don't realize that coal is consistent, ground up to a consistency of talcum powder. It really explodes in the fire box now. It doesn't just burn. So there really isn't much pollution from trolley cars. At its peak, there are 46,000 miles of streetcar track in this country. And I'm not talking about England or France or Germany, Russia, Japan. They all had, Australia, Canada, they all had streetcar systems. And it's a horse and buggy age. Well, most people could not afford horse and buggies, okay, especially in the cities. So they got to work by streetcar. As a matter of fact, a lot of advertising in the help wanted advertising in the newspapers, when we had newspapers, local newspapers, they'd say, 25 cents an hour plus car fares. In other words, they'd give you car fare, streetcar fare. And what was a streetcar fare? Universal in this country, 5 cents. All right. Okay. And some people in Philadelphia, there was a mayor that ran a program of bring down high streetcar fares. I'm all of 5 cents. No, maybe make it 3 cents. Well, he didn't get elected, but that tells you something about the times. So there really was a streetcar empire. In fact, between the cities and towns, often there were streetcars called the interurban lines. These were the size, in fact, the track gauge of railroads, and they competed directly with the railroads. They were cheaper. And so you could take a streetcar from, let's say, Solderton, Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and going through beautiful countryside and so on. Another thing that between the cities that these streetcars had was many of them owned amusement parks. In fact, I would say all of the old amusement parks, some of which are still around, were run by streetcar companies. And they had these open cars. And so on warm summer days, it'd be just beautiful. You ride along through the countryside, and then the end of the line, there's the amusement park. The government said, no, that's monopolistic. You can't have both. So they broke that up, which didn't do the streetcar business any good. Well, you say, well, I hadn't seen a streetcar in years, or I've never seen one. In fact, I know in some of my classes, I have to tell people what a streetcar is. It's like a bus, but it runs on electricity on tracks. Oh God, now I get it. Well, what happened was the peak year was 1929, oddly enough, the year of the stock market crash, and certainly the Depression. I would say every streetcar company was in financial problems, and many of them just went out of business altogether. I think the Roosevelt administration, they had the old populist idea that railroads are bad. And so if railroads are bad, exploiting, then streetcars must be bad too, the streetcar companies. That's why they broke up the connection between the streetcar companies and the amusement parks, for example. And they really were not friends to railroads or streetcars. That was considered the bad old days of the populists, and that they were just out of date. But so that certainly the Depression dealt it a body blow. But an interesting thing happened early in the Depression, and that was the streetcar executive. It was all private then, just like the railroads were private. All the executives got together, and they said, our streetcars are getting old, and people are looking upon them as rattle traps and whatever. In fact, there was a cartoon, the Toonerville Trolley, an old rattletrap trolley going through the countryside. And so they came up with an idea for a modern streamlined trolley car. And, they always say, well, things by committee never really work. But this president's conference committee got together and they produced a streetcar, which even today looks modern. This is what they call the PCC car, President's Conference Committee. I mean, that looks pretty modern today, doesn't it? And some are still on the tracks. I mean, they built them in those days. The last ones were built in 1952, but the one San Francisco, almost it was hobby of collecting streetcars from other cities and running them in the cities, the old cities like colors, like PTC would be green and white, and I'm not talking about the cable cars, and that's entirely different. These are electric streetcars, and San Francisco's got quite a fleet of them, and many of them are from out of town. Okay, the president's conference committee cars were first introduced in 1935, I believe, and they were fast and quiet. I remember in Philadelphia when I was a kid, they got rid of the old trolley cars, kind of grinding along the rails, 19th century technology almost. And then the PCC cars, we called them the streamliners, and they were really, really something. Leather seats, fast. The only thing they would be looked upon and missed today is no air conditioning. But there is a line in Philadelphia, the Girard Avenue line, which got some of these PCC cars and put air conditioning in them, and they seem to be doing quite well. So anyway, it was a constant the Depression, and wartime was a bit of a boom, because of rubber tires, gasoline was hard to get, so people went back to the streetcars more and more. But as soon as the war was over, they went back to the private car. I should have mentioned that, of course, earlier. The other thing that killed off the streetcar was the Model T Ford. People could afford a car now, and they swarmed into the dealer's room of the Ford company and bought cars, and so revenue went down well before the Depression, and then in the Depression, it was they really were. Say many of them went out of business, or in financial trouble. So eventually, by 1985, the number of streetcar companies left in this, not companies, not all, they were all owned by the government by this time, would be New Orleans, Newark, Philadelphia, Boston, and San Francisco. Those are the four cities that still had streetcars. They were all PCC cars, though they got rid of the old cars, and the PCCs helped to save them from financial extinction. But they're all, by this time, the government had taken over because none of the companies were making money. They went bankrupt. For example, in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Transportation Company was taken over in 1965 by the city and then by the regional governments. So the old days of privately owned were done for it. And see, the reason I emphasize that is because if you didn't use the streetcar, you didn't pay for it. You'd save your nickel. Today, you pay taxes for the government-run streetcar, and you have to pay for it, or for the trains, the commuter lines, and everything. Amtrak, you have to pay for it. So it's so a lot of people say, I don't want this new. Now they call them light rail, not streetcars anymore. I don't know why they got rid of the old name. Well, I guess because they don't run in streets that much, they can go everywhere. So they called it light rail. And they would say, well, my kids don't. I don't take the streetcar. Why should I pay for it? A light rail? And you say, well, your kids don't go to school either. You don't have any kids, maybe, but you still pay school taxes. That's one of the arguments in favor of light rail today. Now, what's happened? There's been amazing in this country, especially. Well, let me talk about while we're still in the depths of the depression of the streetcar. In England, I figured out myself when I was over there that by 1966, there was no horizontal electric railway transportation except for the London Underground and the Glasgow Underground. Now, of course, there were commuter trains that were run by electricity, but everything else, that's why horizontal, because the elevators were still running on electricity. But that was it. That was the low point. When I think Glasgow got rid of its trackless trolleys, and I'll talk about them in a minute. That was it, replaced by buses, of course, because buses smell so nice and make, don't make a lot of noise. When I was at Columbia, I was on the 16th floor of my room there, and there were buses on Amsterdam Avenue. I could hear those things yowling as they made their way up what didn't look like a hill at all, but Amsterdam Avenue. I guess there must be some kind of inclination, which just the gears of the buses went into low gear and just howled as they went up that incline. So I had personal experience with buses that I don't like. I should mention the trackless trolley. One of the problems with the trolleys were that they'd be in the middle of the road, more or less, and they couldn't get in to pick up passengers along the curb. And if there was, let's say there's a problem on the tracks, some traffic, a car is broken down or something, they couldn't get around it. But trackless trolleys could, and they were just like a bus, except they had electric motors, and they also ran with double wires, positive and negative, strung overhead. You see, in a trolley car, the tracks are negative and the wires are positive. But trackless trolley, always you tell trackless trolley route could have two wires and two poles also. And the British even built double-decker trackless trolleys. We know about the double-decker trams in London, and Hong Kong has double-decker trams. Okay, amazing. But the trackless was, I think, a good compromise between some of the disadvantages of the streetcar or light rail, if you will. And there are trackless trolleys, sometimes called trolley buses, are still running, and new ones are being built, of course. So there has been this real revival. And the revival started in 1981 in Alberta, Canada. For I don't know exactly why, they put in a light rail system, which is doing very well. And since then, I'd figure every single city in the United States of any size, has plans for some kind of light rail route. And they're all over the place. Even all cars that were basically designed for the city, like Houston, has a trolley car line. San Francisco, Los Angeles has a trolley car line. So they're all over the place. Not, I wouldn't say that exactly, but there has been a revival interest. As I say, every municipal government says, we have to get some kind of a light rail line. And why? Well, because of pollution, basically. And the other thing we found out from light rail is that along those routes, they have the business has increased. People kind of like trolleys. They say, well, let's take the trolley down there and see what, nobody who likes a bus anyway. Okay, but trolleys, that's different. They're quiet, and light rail, should we say, they're quiet, and they have seen real improvement wherever light rail and also new metro lines, wherever they go. They build up business, not super highways. I keep the traffic flowing. Well, yeah, the traffic flows right by your business. Okay, so you got a lot of roads, a lot of cars, but what's there? So that's the other thing, is on the ground, where people work and eat and live. The electric traction, whether it's light rail or trolley buses or whatever, has really made a difference. But the thing is that they're government, run by the government, and I don't want to be political here. I'm just saying that people, you've got it comes out of your taxes now. So obviously, people are reluctant. Whereas in the old days, the excuse me, the owners, the entrepreneurs, would just basically petition or bribe. That happened a lot. The local government and say, let us, build a trolley car line. And then they had certain responsibilities, like up north, they were responsible for snow removal and some other things that along the routes that they were working on. So they were actually very positive. They weren't taking money from they were adding money to the economy. As I said before, if you didn't use it, you didn't have to pay for it. Okay, didn't have to pay that high price of 5 cents. So anyway, I think there is light on the horizon for light rail now. What with COVID and everything, but these projects are actually, many of them, the 24 cities I know of, have seriously considered light rail, and maybe they're on hold right now because of the pandemic. I don't know, but it is a new dawning. So I just leave by showing you again the PCC car, the ultimate street car in so many ways. I think it's a lot better looking than most of the light rail that we have today, but just smooth, almost absolutely quiet. And with no pollution, it had to die. Huh? Well, not quite. Okay. Thank you for watching another episode of Stan the History Man. I'm Dr. Sandler, your host here, and I look forward to talking with you again. Thank you.